Now, Dr. Yehuda Halper on, was Socrates a wise ascetic monotheist or a vocal skeptic? The two Socrateses of medieval Jewish doxography.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Don, for that. See if it shares here. Okay. Great. Can you see my screen here? Okay. All right. Good. So, yes, thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. It's an honor to be here. I'm going to talk a bit about Jewish sources for Socrates, discussing Socrates in the Middle Ages, and this includes a wide range, I guess, of people who talked about Socrates but did not, in fact, read Plato. Certainly not Xenophon. Certainly not Aristophanes or any other of these sources. What they did. The reason they didn't read Plato is because Plato wasn't available, as far as we know, in Hebrew. He was not available in very much. Plato was not available in Latin, and even in Arabic, we don't know exactly how much was available. Perhaps parts of maybe 10 dialogues survive in various forms, but it's not clear if any of them survived in complete form that was available, could be read by people in Arabic. And even if it was available in Arabic, we don't have too much evidence of Jewish people actually reading these works. But we do have some evidence of them talking about Socrates, a kind of reception history, you could say, about Socrates. So, who were these people talking about Socrates among the Jews? We have 4 sources, you could say, talking about mentioning Socrates in Arabic. The earliest is Solomon ibn Gabirol, also Moses ibn Ezra, who talks about it in his book of Conversation and Deliberation, in his treatise of the Garden. Yehuda Halevi in the Kuzari, and Yosef ibn Aknin, who was thought to be the addressee of the guide, but is in fact Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed, but is in fact not the same person. All of these people talk about Socrates. 3 of them talk about him in this kind of doxographical way. That is to say, they talk about sentences, anecdotes, aphorisms that are either connected to Socrates or said or attributed to Socrates. These thinkers all wrote in Arabic, and they were later translated into Hebrew, largely by Yehuda ibn Tibbon, the father of the Ibn Tibbon movement, who was interested in translating what he considered adab or belletristic Arabic literature into Hebrew, or else another Yehuda Al-Ḥarizi, who was another prolific medieval translator. We also have a number of Hebrew sources mentioning Socrates, including Yosef ibn Zabara, who wrote a book called Book of Delights. It's a kind of it's a story, makama. It's a medieval tale, 2 people traveling around discussing witty sayings, mostly medical or some ethical statements, and they also quote Socrates to delight themselves and to delight their readers. Yehuda Al-Ḥarizi, whom I mentioned before, also translated Muhammad al-Ansari's summary of Hunayn ibn Ishaq's Adab al-Falasifa, which is a Lives of the Philosophers that was written in Arabic and was probably, it seems to have been maybe the most influential collection of doxographical material. It's been analyzed by Dimitri Gutas and by numerous others. Most recently, also Muhsin Zakari has been arguing that a lot of the arguments in there actually come from or the stories are really from Persian literature, that they've been translated, and the names sort of became corrupted as they became part of Arabic. And that's why, for example, you will meet Socrates carrying a staff, lecturing in palaces with his staff, with his famous statements on it. The palace doors will have his statements engraved on him, and he'll have a signet ring with various statements, even though Plato's Socrates hardly does much business that would require a kind of signet ring. But this was translated into Hebrew, was quite influential, quite well read. And Socrates also appears in the Hebrew writings of Shem Ṭob Falaquera, who wrote a large number of works, but Socrates appears in his Reshit Chochmah, which includes translations of various works from Al-Farabi. We'll come back to this at the end. His Perfections of Actions, and his commentary on Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed. And in the guide, Maimonides' Guide, Socrates is not mentioned. Socrates also appears in Hebrew translations of Averroes. Later, other Hebrew sources, which is sources that are not reading the material in Arabic, but likely reading them in Hebrew, include Moses Nachmanides, Yosef Kaspi, Moses Narboni, Zerachia Halevi Saladin, Joseph Albo, and an anonymous Prayer of the Divine Socrates, which is what I've sent around. I've translated that and sent it to you, and we'll take a very brief look at it towards the end. Now, if we take all of these sources and we sort of look at what they're doing with Socrates, we can sort of divide it in a way into two distinct Socrateses, two distinct categories. One is a depiction in which the sources depict Socrates as a wise, ascetic monotheist, and you can see that that's. And the other side is those who depict Socrates as a vocal skeptic, which is more like what we might expect from a Socrates. But as you can see, the vast majority of our sources are depicting Socrates as a wise, ascetic monotheist, and do not see him as a vocal skeptic. This is in a way you could say the dominant view, but the view of Socrates as a vocal skeptic is much more clearly related to a Platonic source. So we'll take a look a bit at that. First, just want to add here that this is something unique to the the Jewish reception of Socrates, is the division into these two categories. There's many sources of Arabic doxographical literature. Ilahi alone, for example, compiled a lot of these, and they tend to put together what they can find or have various other notions, and they don't depict a consistent Socrates. They don't always depict they have a compilatory method of putting things together. So you don't see a distinct views of Socrates that are quite different among different works, the way you see in this Jewish literature of this time, spanning from Solomon ibn Gabirol to Joseph Albo. Okay, and all right, so let's take a look a bit at Socrates as this vocal skeptic. Where do we get this? Where do we see this view? We find this view, first of all, in Yehuda Levi's Kuzari, which is a dialogue, though I don't think it's much of a Socratic dialogue. I don't think it's not clear that he knew of Socrates as somebody who participated in dialogues. It has a lot in common with different forms of dialogue in the Middle Ages, such as the Makama, which I already mentioned, and also religious Kalamic dialogues. And it doesn't necessarily fit into a category of what we might call a Socratic dialogue. But we do find him a short reference to Socrates, who is speaking, to the adherents of the religious law, people who are following the Sharia, which is the religious people, and saying, "O nation, this divine wisdom of yours, I do not contest it, but I say that I do not comprehend it. Indeed, I am wise with the human wisdom." And he is saying to them that he's not able to apply philosophical categories, rational categories to religious law to things that go beyond human wisdom to the divine, to this monotheistic. And we're going to focus in what follows on Socrates' relationship to monotheism or to theological claims, according to this group of sources here. He's also distinguished here by Halevi from other philosophers who do, like Plato, for example, in his view, and Aristotle, who, according to Halevi, do have a lot to say about the divine and the creation of the world and God's governance of the world, whereas Socrates, in this instance, says nothing. Now, where does this come from? It is initially from probably related, perhaps, to Plato's Apology. It's not a direct quote. This is here in my translation. Actually, all the translations are mine, unless I put a little note otherwise here. We can see here that he doesn't have a wisdom that's greater than according to men. There's similar statements in Xenophon, but they don't appear in Arabic, to my knowledge. They do appear also in Farabi's book of demonstration, which is a book about how to do Aristotelian-style demonstrations, where he, again, like Halevi, is saying that he's actually taking up Socrates' position, whereas Halevi is saying this is not a position. I mean, his main character doesn't take up the Socratic position, but Farabi himself identifies with this and says, no, demonstration is applied to the human things. We use demonstration as a technique to study human topics, and this includes things that are not about the divine. So we don't reason demonstratively about the divine. And he also has this statement, which he attributes to the Apology: O people, I do not say that this divine wisdom of yours is a futile thing. I say only that I am not worthy of it, for I say only that I am wise with the human wisdom. Could be an end quote there. Okay. So similarly with demonstration, we actually find the statement again appears in Averroes, which I bring here together with the medieval Hebrew translation. Even though Averroes is bringing this in his middle commentary on the Parva Naturalia, where he's discussing prophecy through dreams. And in Averroes' version, you can actually reason about, or you can somehow achieve some kind of rational knowledge of prophetic truths through dreams. More or less, that's his view here. So, but he still brings this quote. Halevi didn't read Averroes because he was older. He died before Averroes wrote this, or wrote anything really. But it's still something that is going around. And if we look at Averroes again as another source of this kind of Socrates, perhaps not he's in a way skeptical. He doesn't treat theological monotheistic terms in Halevi, but we'll see that he's actually much more strongly skeptical in Averroes' writings as they come down to us. So we have, this is surprisingly the one place where Averroes really does not discuss Socrates is in the commentary on Plato's Republic. This is, in fact, the only mention of Socrates in Plato's Republic. I'm just going to bring it in very, very briefly that he chooses death over life when he sees that he can't live a human life in the city. Not from the Republic, might be influenced by the Apology, but not. There's no direct connection to the Plato's Apology here. Where Averroes talks more about Socrates is in the Rhetoric and in the commentary on the Ethics, both of which were translated into Hebrew, and both of which were quite important in the history of medieval Jewish thought. They were studied in schools, etc. Anyway, I'll go into that. But Socrates comes up in unusual ways, and most of it sometimes due to misunderstandings. So if we look here at Aristotle's Rhetoric 141a 31 here, we have the following statement as it appears in the Greek. One who is at a loss ought to do what the Athenian orators, even Isocrates, did. Even when deliberating, he makes accusations. For example, against the Lacedaemonians in his Panegyricus and against the Cares in his Symmachicos, 2 books. Right? Now, this is preserved fairly well with a little bit of differences in the Arabic translation, which we have because it's survived and was edited by M.C. Lyons in 1982. And it says, one who doubts or is stricken in years. And this stricken in years, I don't know, it may have come from a marginal note or some other interpolation or an interpretation of what it is. So he has this doubting thing, which is related to the Arabic shak, which is having doubts or skeptical doubts there. And stricken in years is not, we don't see it in the Greek, but it's just the Arabic is ta'in Fisinna, stricken in the years. I'll come back to that Arabic in a bit. Okay, one who doubts or is stricken in years ought to do what the Athenian orators did, and also Isocrates did. For he made accusations even when he deliberated. And this actually may remind some of you of last night's debate, where people who are aphoretic and stricken in years are making accusations. All right, that was meant to be a joke. I know we can't hear if anyone's laughing, but in any case, this stricken in years business, the ta'in fisinna, is apparently taken by Averroes as ta'in fisunna. And sunnah, you may be familiar with this Arabic term from Sunni, meaning the law. And accordingly, his commentary has the following line. One who doubts the premises held by the law. And here you can see here on the sunnah here. One who doubts the premises held by the law ought to do what Socrates did with the orders of the community of the Athenians. For he criticized those premises somewhat before them, as I reckon it, by interpreting them. For interpretation is a criticism of a statement. So here we have a much more strongly skeptical Socrates. He's criticizing the premises held by the law. He's striking them. Ta'in fisunna. He's striking the and here he adds the premises. He's attacking the premises. How is he attacking those premises? Via interpretation. This has many implications for Averroes' own theory of interpretation, which I won't get into, but just want to point out here that we have a Socrates who's not only saying I can't reason about the divine things, but he's saying that I'm going to doubt and question and use interpretation to question and attack even the premises of the law. We find a similar view expressed also in the ethics and the ethics commentary, where we're actually missing this in the Arabic. This particular passage is missing in the Arabic translation, but it's where Aristotle famously talks about the ironic people, where he includes Socrates among the Eirones. The ironic people, he says, who disown things held in high esteem, as Socrates used to do. Now, somehow, in Averroes' commentary, which only survives in the Hebrew translation, but that's what Jewish people were reading in the Middle Ages, or in European Middle Ages, said, have base people, he says, who did not exaggerate in denying the exalted notions as Socrates did. So here it's very strong, and it's the Hebrew, for those of you who know Hebrew, the kfirat, he's really denying those, he's attacking it, denying the notions that are held to be exalted by all the people. So this is a kind of glimpse, based on a few select quotations, of the sort of Socrates, the vocal skeptic. We all know his end, though somehow he may have chosen his end, but he's attacking the premises of the law, he's denying the exalted notions, and he's saying that he's unwilling to reason about things that are beyond human reason, specifically prophecy and the divine things. More or less, in a way, this Socrates is clearly incompatible to a certain extent with medieval notions of, or simple notions of monotheism, living in a monotheistic society. He's questioning them, denying them, arguing with the premises, perhaps, and he's clearly not very obviously, in a way, not a religious Jew, which is not a problem per se, but we'll see that in the other Socrates, his not being a medieval religious Jew is not quite so clear, as we would see in this Socrates. Okay, so we'll turn now to the second part of the talk, Socrates the monotheist. And we'll just bring a few of the sources that I mentioned earlier to show you it's kind of the depiction of this other Socrates. And I think it will become immediately clear why this Socrates is not compatible with the vocal skeptic Socrates of Yehuda Halper and Averroes and the Hebrew translations of Averroes. This book of Moses ibn Ezra is the book of conversation and deliberation. It's sometimes considered the first book of literary criticism or poetic theory, or the first Jewish book of poetic theory, and it quotes a lot of various sources to support his arguments about how to write with poetry, why Andalusian poetry is so much better than everybody else's poetry, questions like that, which he wrote in Arabic here, with Judeo-Arabic with Hebrew letters. And he says, Socrates said, the law requires us to keep far away from sin, and philosophy teaches us the reason for this. The difference between the law and political philosophy is that political actions are particular, lacking, and dependent on the law, while the acts of the law are universal, perfect, and not dependent on political actions. So we have here a clear relationship between philosophy and law, and law is clearly superior in a way to the actions at least, and you can learn about the law through philosophy. There's no hint of skepticism. Socrates is not questioning the law. He's not undermining it. He's certainly not denying the principles or questioning any premises. He's using philosophy to understand what the law, how to really follow, how to follow the law. And he uses both terms for law in Arabic here, sunnah here, and then al-sharia here in this passage. Another book of Moses ibn Ezra is called the Treatise of the Garden. I just bring it briefly here in the French I didn't have access to the original, so rather than translating from French to English, or translating it would have been from Arabic, twice translated. I just brought you the French. You can look at it here. But we have Socrates. These are prayers that Socrates mentions in this Treatise of the Garden. And we have, this is more of a philosophical, exegetical text of Moses ibn Ezra. And he is here, he's talking about God's being both very near and far away at the same time, and this kind of incongruity of it, the difficulty of understanding it, which is a kind of standard, in a way, Jewish theme. Yehuda Halper, who was actually friends with Moses ibn Ezra, quite close contact throughout their careers, also has a famous poem that where can I find you, O God, and where can I not find you? Ana emsa'acha v'ana lo emsa'acha. Where will I find you, God, and where can I not find you? In this kind of religious paradox of having God at one hand both very near, understanding God, thinking about God in your thoughts, but on the other hand, God is beyond human thoughts and can't be understood. We have Moses ibn Ezra has Socrates depicting this kind of wonderment as well in his prayer. We also see a similar religious Socrates in our Joseph ibn Zabara in his Sefer Sha'ashuim, where he says, who is the most generous of all men? he who is generous in the world now so as to complete the world to come. Right, so to get to the world to come, here is the notion, the life after death. He was a hero among men. He said, he who fears God with all his heart. Right, these are generic, in a way, statements, religious monotheistic statements that are here attributed to Socrates. We'll just look at a few more here. What comes into Hebrew through Yehuda Al-Ḥarizi's Musarei Philosophim. We have this short dialogue of Socrates with the king, who is the king. His son has died, and Socrates writes to him that the Creator made this house a world a house of loss, but the world to come is a house of reward, and his redemption of the world to come is a replacement for this world. This is clearly a very different Socrates from the one that we usually see that we would see in Halevi or Averroes, certainly in there. Al-Ḥarizi also has a different Socrates. He has Socrates lives in this is a translation of Ansari's summary of Hunayn ibn Ishaq's Adab al-Falasifa, where Socrates also lives in a barrel in the middle of Athens. A great king comes to reward him, and he refuses the reward, and he disavows all possessions. So he's clearly there's somehow Socrates has become associated with stories that we are familiar with Diogenes the Cynic. We also see here Socrates' advice. Right? Put your affairs in the hands of the Creator and do not make choices yourself. Of what account is man that he should choose something for himself that can then be overturned? It's very humble view. Let God make your choices. Don't overextend yourself. One more brief bit about Al-Ḥarizi to show you again what else we see among Jewish thinkers. What access they had to Socrates in Hebrew. We have this strange story where the king said to Socrates, "It has been told to me repeatedly that you said that idols grant neither benefit nor harm." Socrates said, "It is true that they can grant benefit or harm to the king or to his confederates, but to Socrates and his confederates, they can grant neither benefit nor harm." So he doesn't need idols. He can seek the political uses for idols in the city, but he himself is beyond them. And we could see from the other statements, if we take them together, we get the impression that he's beyond them because he's a devout monotheist, not because he's questioning, like in the Averroes quotes or in the Halevi quote, but because he's a devout monotheist and he doesn't need idols here. He's in a way, these views are, they come from, this is a direct translation from an Arabic compilation of stories of the philosophers, and to some extent they portray Socrates as a kind of pre-monotheistic monotheist, pre-Islamic monotheist in a way, much like depictions of, or somewhat like depictions of Abraham or other thinkers who come to an understanding of monotheism on their own, and at least that's one possibility. And then think about sort of have a kind of religious understanding that they arrive at on their own. And this would have, to a certain extent, Hunayn ibn Ishaq, who made this original compilation, was also a translator. His father was a translator. His father was Ishaq ibn Hunayn. They were translators from Greek into Arabic, and these notions may have been important in making Socrates halal for Muslim audiences. That he would have been okay. It would have been proper. It would have been okay to study him. And we also have this in the this other work that's now lost, but we have a work attributed to Al-Kindi, which is called On What Transpired Between Socrates and the Charanians, which ends in Socrates' death at the hands of a king, is somehow also there again on the grounds that he is a devout monotheist. So another thing we can see about these is that, well, for some of these characters are associated with Neoplatonism. We don't really see any Neoplatonism in their depictions of Socrates, and we don't really see much Neoplatonism in their depictions of Plato either. But that's a different story. The final thinker to look at a bit is this Shem Ṭob Falaquera, who's a prolific author and translator. He brought he wrote this whole list of works that I have here on the left, and on the right I have some works that were incorporated into his other works, many of them by Farabi. And you can see especially Farabi's famous Philosophy of Plato, which discusses the works that he wrote and the order in which he wrote them, many of which, and in which, as you can imagine, Socrates plays a rather important part. But he's pretty much been removed from Falaquera's versions, which occurred in the Reshit Chochmah. Socrates he only shows up in association with one book, which is a book on pleasure, Sifra Ta'anug, and probably is a reference to the Symposium, but it's been somewhat changed through, well, first Farabi's interpretation and then Falaquera's interpretation and translation, interpretive translation, loose translation of it. Other depictions that Falaquera has are in his work called The Perfection of Actions, which he thought perhaps was a translation of a summary of Aristotle's Ethics, but was most likely, as Stephen Harvey has shown, a translation of the Summa Alexandrinorum, which is a kind of, in a way, a summary of the Ethics, but an entirely different work. And we have certain things. The first passage is parallel to the Eirones passage in the Nicomachean Ethics, where, but here it's a very different reason, right? He's not rejecting the glorious things or the notions that are held in high regard, because he's questioning them, but here he's doing it so as to avoid hard work and dispute. Right? Because Socrates really liked to have a rest in life, an easy life, and not to work too hard at disputation. And he talks about Socrates sees people wrapped up in the waves, and that's it. So and again we have he has his kind of he's set apart. So to depict who is ascetic, insofar as he gives up his. I didn't concentrate on that too much, but he gives up his house. He gives up living in a city, or in a civilization, what we would call it, lives in a barrel, doesn't collect objects, and he is devout monotheist. He prays devoutly, and he really doesn't question the law, but he supplements the law with philosophy to some extent. Whereas we have another view of Socrates, which we saw briefly in Halevi and in Averroes, which shows us a Socrates who is questioning, critiquing the law, and disavowing knowledge of anything that is beyond what can be known by human means alone. Let me see if I can get this to the prayer here. The final bit here is this prayer of Socrates, which is in the oldest version is the first half of the 14th century. In the British Library, we have this manuscript. It's the one I had in the picture at the very beginning. We have this prayer attributed to Socrates. In later versions, it says that he said it every day, in the morning. And there's about, let's see, there are 5 versions of this prayer in 4 different manuscripts. One manuscript has it twice in different versions, slightly different versions. But we can see a few if you take a look at it. And I'm actually would be very grateful to have any insights you might have on it, because this is a very enigmatic prayer, which is one of my motivations for sending it to you, is to try to figure out what you have to say, what I can learn from you about it. But we have a few things that you may see that are quite striking. He says here, may you be blessed, may you be blessed, may you be blessed. We have 3 times, right? The blessing at 3 times, and these correspond to the 3 different worlds. The beginning is the first, eternal of the eternals, O primary, who departs not before changing times and passing seasons, who are holy, mighty, and pure, God, right? We have here the second blessing, the essence that is highest, perpetual, eternal, brightest, clearest, most pure. First of all, the luminaries of light sustain intellectual powers and illuminate the faces of created things, a kind of associated with the spheres, perhaps, some kind of heavenly realm. And the third, may you be blessed, concerns here God, from whom are mentions at least the lives of the spirits of the spiritual beings in the forms of the angelic soul, so the angelic world. To me, the first thought I would have, this you have 3 things unfolding, is probably some kind of Neoplatonic influence that we see that is involved here in this poem. He asks here to become part of a joining God's name, leaving the sea of the waves of ignorance, right? If you recall, we saw the mention, Socrates' desire to leave the waves was mentioned in Falaquera's work before. So maybe there's a connection between these 2. I don't know. And he wants to be transported beyond the rule of natures, beyond the cloud of desire, to the path of intellect, and to grasp light by your luminaries, by God's luminaries, by the sun and the moon, by the understanding the heavenly bodies, by separating the intellect, etc. So it's a question that he has his regret. Sorry, I didn't come to my intellect until I was very old, and I want to give you back what's yours. These are themes that are common in religious prayer. Also the form, but I get religious Jewish prayer. But I don't have much time, so I won't go into that now. So we have a number of requests to be saved from the accidents of the elements. He wants to go from the knowledge of the separate letters. My destruction not be among the letters that are likenesses in the lower world. This is this no focus on the letters may suggest some kind of Kabbalistic influence on the one hand, but it can also be my friend Vincenzo Carlotta suggested to me that it could be have to do with the translation of the Greek word stoicheia, which can be elements or letters, and then in fact he's referring somehow to elements. If you translate elements, it makes a lot more sense, but the ambiguity is not present, unfortunately, in the Hebrew term. And we have here at the very end a sort of request, which doesn't appear in the other versions of the prayer, but it does appear in the oldest version. So that doesn't mean it's the best version. May it be your will, O Lord, my God and God of my fathers, that's a standard Hebrew prayer formula, to purify the arrangements of my thoughts and to establish an answer for my speech. It's a request for good thoughts and good speech, which could, in one sense, you could say, oh, this implies a kind of skepticism. He doesn't know what's good or what's not good. But this is in fact a standard it's a standard religious refrain in Jewish prayer, going back all the way to the Talmudic period. to ask God to arrange one's thoughts, arrange one's speech in such a way that would be acceptable, because what's acceptable to God is beyond the scope of human knowledge, and that kind of request is considered a mark of great devotion, as he ends here with this quote from Psalms. So this is the Socrates, the devout monotheistic Socrates that we can see in this prayer, and in the vast majority of Jewish sources. It's the Socrates who is perhaps philosophically doesn't raise too many philosophical questions. He is acceptable to some, but not to all. Later thinkers such as Nachmanides was not happy with Socrates. He says that his disavowal of possessions leads him not to treat things like mourning the dead seriously enough. Was part of his criticism. There's criticism, of course, by Zerachia Halevi Saladin about Socrates' the community of women, which doesn't appear in any other source in Hebrew, just there. So I don't know if he got it. It could be from there's a little bit of some allusions to it in the comment Averroes' commentary on Plato's Republic. So he could have had it from there, and but he could also have had some kind of influence from Christian thinkers, though in general, I should add here at the very end that there's no clear indication to me of any influence from any Latin or European Christian thinkers. I mean, say European, Hunayn ibn Ishaq and Ishaq ibn Hunayn were Christians, so they came through the Arabic and through the Muslim tradition. We have a notion of it. So, so I think we can see from this is that, I'll stop the share here. I think what we can see through this, and I'll conclude, that Socrates appears in Jewish thought in a rather in a unique and somewhat idiosyncratic way, that you don't find him in really in any other tradition, though it is similar, very largely similar to the Muslim traditions, where you have these two Socrateses in the Jewish views, one of whom is a devout ascetic monotheist, and the other is this more skeptical, questioning person who is asking questions about the very foundations of the law, questions which end up getting him into trouble. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I can't, one of the disadvantages of this format is that we can't get thunderous applause because too many people are muted. So I'll give some symbolic applause. I invite you to, now for the discussion, to raise your hands. I see Michael Pakalik has put up a kind of potential parallel text. Michael, why don't you tell us about that and ask a question related to it?
I actually don't know very much about the origin of this prayer of Aquinas, whether it's reliably attributed to him or not. But it seems to me that Yehuda, what is the dating of this prayer of Socrates?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and this is very helpful. I need to look at this in some detail. I'm trying to. I copied it here onto my. Maybe I'll bug you at some point about it some more. The prayer itself, we don't have a date from it. It's been written about before. It was thought to be a 15th century one, but in fact it shows up in a manuscript. This British Library manuscript, which we know, we know it's written between 1332 and 1350 the manuscript is. That doesn't mean it's probably copying the prayer from somewhere else, but we know it's from that time because there's a large discussion of the calendar, Jewish calendar, which goes in 19-year segments. So it actually, and it's done by the same hand. So he actually talks about which 19-year segment they're in, and assuming that, I mean, it looks like from paleographically, it looks like he finished the manuscript in the same 19 years then, or at least it's around that time. So we can say first half of the 14th century.
I'm not suggesting there's any influence on Aquinas or Christian tradition on the author of this prayer, but it looks like, to me, it looks like the correspondences are too great to be by chance. So I would expect it to be some kind of common tradition that they're both drawing upon.
That's very helpful. I want to look into that more.
That's all for me.
Noboru.
Hello, Yehuda. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk, and I'm very interested in your stuff. I ask one question which may relate to your talk. How much did the Jewish thinkers know about the biography of Socrates? Because both sides can be related to some of the trial of Socrates, or kind of persecution of a religious reason, maybe because the first side, the vocal skeptic side, the apology is one of the sources. Then, of course, that is related to the God-human relationship, and the other side is also can be related to the Socratic trial. So, or either they knew very vaguely about the historical background of Socrates' death, or just they use without any knowledge of that kind of things, just use Socrates as a wise man. This is my question.
Thank you. Yeah. So what we do know is that they do have some idea of some kind of trial of Socrates. And that most of them, I couldn't say this about all of them. Some of them, they just have a few sentences attributed to Socrates, but he does show up in a few of them. They know that he had a trial and that he was killed. Though in the Averroes, in one place in the Averroes text, Socrates he says he chooses to die. In another place, he does actually say he was put to death. So these are not incongruous if you know the final last days of Socrates series of dialogues, but we don't know that they did. We don't know what they knew, and this is a big difficulty in interpreting Jewish philosophical texts, but also Arabic texts, because even the ones who did, we find like large sections of the Phaedo translated in Mitruni's stories about India, but we don't know how much those were available, or who really read them, or if people really took them seriously as philosophical stories. So these are all open questions. I don't have a good answer, but it does. What we can say, what I think is interesting, is that the reasons for the death would be quite different. If the monotheistic version, the friction that he has with the king is due to the king's polytheism and Socrates' monotheism, and he ends up becoming kind of a, if he dies, he's a religious martyr of some kind, though it's very vague. Whereas when he's questioning the premises of the law in the Averroes, he's on the heretical side against Islam. So it's very different, his part there.
Yeah, thank you very much.
All right. I'll make the remark that I do at many of these, that our community turns out to be a community of good people. And so when there's a large crowd, people tend to hold back and not ask questions to leave room for others. And so I invite you to to push past that and to put yourself forward. I have a question. Socrates is famously mentioned in several places in Aristotle's works, and scholars try to use these remarks about Socrates as a kind of lever to understand the historical Socrates. Were there remarks about Socrates, or might there be remarks about Socrates in the context of commenting on these passages? I mean, I really know nothing here, so it's a naive question.
No, it's not a. It's a. In Averroes' commentaries on these passages, he does show up, but it sometimes there's a surprising amount of corruption when it comes to Socrates, which is also suggests to me that they did not really know who he was. So in the quote one of the quotes I brought to you from the Rhetoric, Aristotle was talking about I Socrates, right, the orator, and it came into Arabic as I Socrates, which is very similar both in Arabic and as it is in English, though it's less similar in Greek because of the Omicron and Omega business. But it looks quite similar. So and Averroes takes it as Socrates in there. There's another passage in the Rhetoric where Aristotle talks about actually the Meletus discussion, which is in the Apology, and we would expect something there, but it's been quite corrupted in Aristotle's in the translation into Arabic, and Averroes' remarks end up discussing Christianity. So it's been and not mentioning Socrates at all. So and there's a great deal, and I have another talk I guess I could give entirely on the question of akrasia, which is associated with Socrates in Averroes, and that problem actually becomes, I think, in my view, very important for Averroes. But that's for another time.
All right, Sandra Peterson. Sandra?
Sorry. Yes, it took me a while to unmute. Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Well, my question is so ignorant, I'm embarrassed to ask it, but I'm looking at the prayer, and the first three things seem so weird to me. I mean, it says, I'm addressing God if I'm giving this prayer, and I'm saying, may you be blessed. I had no idea blessing could go in that direction, from people to God. I thought it went the other way around. So I'm sorry to ask, but...
It's a great question, but it's a question that is in a way it's a question that it does bother a lot of people nowadays, because the standard formulation of a blessing in the Talmudic Hebrew is to say that God, you are blessed, Baruch, right? And this is the future of that, Tivorach, or the may you, the optative or the subjunctive, or however you want to discuss this in the Hebrew. Anyway, but it is definitely in this kind of God is the one who is blessed. But there are modern rabbis who like to retranslate these blessings and say things like, "Oh, you are the source of blessing, oh God," because there is a kind of incongruity in this. What does it mean? So that's not really an answer, but.
Well, thank you.
All right, I've through the chat, I've got a question from Gabriel Danzig. Gabriel?
There, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, Yehuda. Thank you for this wonderful talk and these incredible sources. I'm just wondering what we can do with them further. You seem to highlight the fact that we don't have a knowledge of really where they, the transmission, where they came from. But we saw variations in the let's call it the apology quotation about human versus divine wisdom between the three different sources. And I wondered if you thought of relating them to the, philosophies of the various authors that presented them. I mean, obviously you'd want to know the sources, but since we don't have the sources, we might be able to account for the differences in that way, or at least, offer a proposal. I was also, in the same line, I was interested in the Averroes on the kfira that you quoted, which I think is a very big change from what Aristotle was saying. I don't think Aristotle was suggesting that Socrates denied, maybe, I mean, it wasn't my impression. I'll have to think about it again. I mean, Socrates did have problems with the Greek religion, but my impression from the Aristotle passage is that he was simply denying that he himself had some of the endoxa, some of the, wonderful qualities that people normally try to claim for themselves. So that would be an interesting transformation in Averroes.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, I think that is a transformation in Averroes. I don't think that that's in the. I mean, that, as I mentioned, that passage is actually missing in the Arabic translation. The Arabic, it's very difficult to translate from Greek into Arabic. But it is quite easy in a way to translate. If you translate in the medieval style, it's very easy to translate from Arabic into Hebrew, which is the medieval style is just to translate each word by an exact, if possible, cognate word or another word, one word for word translations. And if it doesn't sound, if it's not the normal way, or if it's not a biblical or rabbinical sentence structure, then that's okay. It's a scientific Arabized structure. So that was, we have in a way a good account of what the words probably may have been, but the particular word for the kfira, of denying, that's a very important word in Arabic. It can be, the cognate is extremely important. It's not likely to have been that, but it's a good question. How far has Averroes actually strayed from Aristotle in doing that? But certainly this notion of irony is certainly lost. And as to your other suggestion, I know that I mean, both of us have written on Halevi on this subject in articles, and that will be the Farabi one is also, I think there's more to be done with that, but and again with the Averroes, again, that's also a very complicated issue that Shem Ṭob wrote about, how much of that sort of prophetic knowledge can be done through dreams, how there can be an account of that, which is in a way which Aristotle seems not to be saying in the Greek texts that we have, but somehow in the Arabic translations, he says that, well, actually you can get a kind of knowledge of this divine intellect, which is important there. So it's connected to that translation passage. But yeah, there is more to explore there. And just, I think I think my own view is there's a lot more to explore with the Averroes, and that is, I don't promote my book here, but another chapter, I have a whole chapter dedicated to the many other quotes. Every quote I could find in Averroes dealing with Socrates, and a view that's coherent and actually extremely important to Averroes' own thought does emerge.
Tanya Hashofsky.
Hi. I don't really know how to phrase a question out of this, but just going back to what Michael said about relating Aquinas to the prayer. When I was when you were reading through it and I was reading through it, it actually reminded me a lot of one of the prayers within the Jewish tradition that they say every day in the services, Amidah, or the Shemona Esrei. I'm not sure what the English translation would be. And I don't really know how to form a question out of that, but it just reminds me a lot of that. And I think that predates Aquinas. So I don't know if there's anything more to say on that.
Well, so I mean, thank you for that. There are unquestionably Hebrew elements to this prayer. I mean, so many that it's impossible that Socrates actually said it, right? It's the if any of you had any doubt, Socrates did not actually say that prayer, but there are similarities to it, and there's particularly I believe you're referring to the prayer for at the very end of the daily prayers. There's a short prayer in the Jewish tradition asking God also to direct one's speech and other people's speech also to good ends. Particularly help other people, help you, save you, perhaps also from other people's bad speech, and to make sure that your own speech goes to the right, in the right direction and for the right end. So that last section does correspond in a way to that prayer. It's also not quite clear to me whether that last section is actually authentic to the prayer, is even intended to be authentic to the prayer, or not intended as a supplication for the reader to say after he's read Socrates' prayer. So that's another possibility. But that's I don't know how to even answer such a question. It's that looking at the form of the prayer, it's sometimes you have a prayer and then you have another supplication that you add to the prayer. So that could be.
Okay, God Weber.
Thank you. Yehuda, I have a question. This occurred to me when you were reading one of the passages from Moses ibn Ezra, and Socrates presents himself as an adherent to the law. I don't have the text in front of me, but it stuck out. And it occurred to me that in the Guide of the Perplexed, sometimes I feel like Maimonides, when he talks about the law, he isn't referring to the Jewish Torah. He's referring to an abstract possibility that, on the one hand, there's Aristotelian philosophy where reality is the necessary result of the existence of God, and the other possibility is that God possesses will, and he gives commandments, and he punishes, he pays attention, and it's an abstract possibility which could include either Islam or Judaism or any other religion that has all those qualities. And so I was wondering if Socrates might not be being presented in that kind of light as a Gentile, accepting the abstract possibility of a religious law and not necessarily Jewish law.
Yeah, I think that is what's going on here to a certain extent, and I think the idea that there is such a law. I mean, it's a question I guess you could ask is perhaps somebody living in Andalusia in the 12th century was not able to imagine a world without a religious law, right? Or another law, or just as in a way, so many of us have a hard time imagining a religious law, and what that could mean as law. And in a way, yeah, of course, Athens had religious laws as well, but they had different. So it's hard to know exactly what's going on in these figures. But I do. My sense is that they're bringing them. They're not antiquarians in the same way. They're bringing them as authorities. They're bringing them as something that is intended to help the reader think about some aspect of his or well, mostly his, unfortunately, own law. And so, yeah, I mean, I think he's presenting Socrates as an early adherent of some kind of religious law, in a way, like I said, like Abraham, like depictions of Abraham in Islamic traditions.
If I can follow up for a moment, I believe that the Moshe Ibn Ezra text is addressed to Muslims just as much as to Jews or to Christians.
The Ibn Ezra text probably not. That's a good question about the Ibn Ezra text. Probably not. In my view, I don't want to get. There's controversies about this that I don't want to enter into. But the probably not. But he is probably taking the view from somebody else. I think it unlikely that he has his own original view of studied view of Socrates, but rather that he's kind of picking, and this is true of most of these thinkers. Averroes and Halevi are exceptions, and Falaquera is probably an exception. But most of these people do not have a considered view, in a way, of Socrates. They hear things, they read things, they have a kind of notion that they gather, and they use these quotes to sort of bolster other things that are going on in their arguments.
Okay, Andrea.
Hi, thank you very much. So I have, I guess, three questions. The first one is on the language. So at some point, you said somebody attributed something to the apology. In Greek, we have the verb. We have two verbs in order to say to say. We have lego and femi. And although the matter is very complicated and we must differentiate, it's clear that in some texts, at least, the word femi is used not in order to quote, but in order to interpret. That is, what in place of saying he's saying that, or what he means is. So I would like to be interested in knowing whether there is a difference in the language in general in Hebrew, and if it's functional or not. The second question is, I was very intrigued by the Averroes phrase, interpretation is criticism. I would like to know more about it. It seems to me so improbable that it seems to me very interesting. I would like to know more about the background and so on. And then the third thing is, okay, we are talking about Socrates because we are interested in Socrates. But then what we learn about Socrates is weird. Somebody said, I don't know what to do with this. And so the question is, does it make sense to have a history of the reception of Socrates independently of a history of the reception of other thinkers? In other terms, does what those thinkers say about Socrates doesn't make more sense if you confront it with other images of Greek philosophers, or so it is not a comparative approach necessary to just understand what these people are doing.
Okay, thank you for that, and that especially the last one, which is something I probably should have made clearer earlier. But let me start with the first one, this difference between the femi and lego. There's no comparable distinction in Hebrew between or in Arabic, as far as I know, between the terms. And in general, but yeah. so I don't know if the question is if the way of speaking is the same. The question of the apology, the reference to the apology that was in the Al-Farabi book of demonstration, that's a little more complicated because there's a number of books, and it's not always so clear which book is being referred to. They have, they get these Arabic names, and it's not always clear if the book is the Apology or the Crito. And it's not clear if they didn't actually have the book, then we wouldn't know which one. Maybe they're called, maybe they're misnaming it, or maybe they just don't have the book and they don't know. So there's a lot of questions surrounding these kinds of attributions to a text. As for the interpretation as criticism, that's in this commentary on the rhetoric, which is a nice edition, and the French translation by Marwan Awad, which is available. It's in the context of the rhetoric. It's a relatively you could say a throwaway line. It's an aside that he makes there. Because the whole discussion, the mention of Socrates is an aside to the discussion of rhetoric, and he sort of puts that in. But in the decisive treatise, Fasl al-Makal, which is quite well known, that the interpretation as a kind of questioning or critique is much more central, and that's why for Averroes, when he's speaking as a jurist in the decisive treatise, the majority of people are forbidden from interpreting the text because it is a kind of, to interpret is to criticize, is to change, but they have to accept the literal interpretation of the text, so that when the world was created, God's throne was on the water, for example, and not to interpret that literally, but to believe it simpliciter. As for the value of the independent history,
excuse me. So that's one tradition in the Hebrew thinking, but it's certainly not the only one, right?
Of interpretation as criticism.
Yes.
Right. In the Hebrew, that's in Arabic. That's that's Averroes.
Sorry, in the Arabic. So okay.
It's not the only interpretation, certainly in Arabic. There are a lot of many schools of thought, many of which are not at all literalists, or not. They don't claim to be literalists at all. In the Jewish tradition, I'm not aware of literalists in the same way.
Exactly. That's not the other way around, right?
Even the Karaite thinkers, I don't think you'll find too many strict literalists, really. But so that view in Maimonides was in for interpretation and for increasing interpretation. But that's another story. I don't know how much they took that. As for the third question about Socrates as independent history, so what I want to emphasize here, I guess, is, and I should have maybe made this clearer during the paper, but the vocal skeptic Socrates, what's interesting about him, and that's what we find in Halevi and in Averroes, is that he's the only one who does this kind of criticism of the law from the perspective of human reason. We don't find this is very clear in Halevi, and nobody else says, okay, we don't know what's beyond human knowledge, or we don't know what's sort of the kind of divine things. We can't think about these divine things, these prophetic things. For Halevi, as for Averroes, Plato and Aristotle both have some kind of philosophical notion of prophecy. This may be different from what we're used to seeing if we read, modern critical editions of Aristotle, or Plato, but this is not what they have. Well, Aristotle, but so which you can. So he does have an independent function in there, and he is different from other thinkers. And I think in the case of Plato, of the second Socrates, the monotheistic Socrates, he is in a way, also set apart in that he's more similar to other thinkers, Plato and Aristotle, as they appear in these traditions, and many of his statements are attributed, the same statements can be attributed to Socrates in one place and to Plato in another place sometimes. But you do see a kind of, he's a little bit closer, I think. He has prayers that are a little bit more Jewish than Plato or Aristotle, and that's, I guess, would be a subject of another comparison. There are prayers attributed to Plato and Aristotle as well in the Jewish tradition. Aristotle in particular is somewhat suspect because he's always considered to not to think the world was eternal, and so not to really, he can't really be religious in the same way. But but Socrates is actually a little closer than the others in this view. So that in that sense, he's distinct according to both views.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Someone had their hand up and took it down again. I want to make sure that may have been someone who had to leave, but if you are that person and still want to ask a question, I want to signal that and give an opportunity. Otherwise, I have a comment cum question. We're told, we all believe, right? Socrates was one remarkable thing about him as world historically important philosopher is he didn't write anything. Well, we have some stuff with Socrates' name on it, handed down to us. We've got the letters of Socrates. There was a correspondence between Socrates and the other Socratics. And people pay attention to Plato's letters, but there's this other body of material that's, to my mind, unjustly neglected. That is, it's neglected, and anything that's neglected from antiquity, it's unjust. Because there's so little of it, it all deserves to be paid attention to. So we've got letters of Socrates surviving. Now we have this prayer. So there's one grouping, literary grouping, to which this book, this prayer belongs, namely the works handed down to us from the tradition, falsely ascribed to Socrates. And so this prayer's got the same status as Pseudo-Galen in Arabic. And now you tell me that we've got prayers from these classical philosophers handed down. I'm thrilled at the discovery of this genre. I just wanted to make those couple of comments about genre.
Yeah, no, thank you. I would be really interested to hear of any parallels between the prayers that I've highlighted here and other bits about it. I think that it's a very it's a really fascinating question. This kind of this question. So this comment. So any kind of similarity would be very helpful. Please don't hesitate to write me. I put my email on the prayer translation that I made, and it should be available hopefully to you as well. So please, if you have something and if you see something, say something, as they say in New York.
All right, let's thank our speaker, and let me say a word about the next colloquium in 2 weeks, which is by Marcello Boeri on Socratic epistemology, and his colloquium will be, he will give his colloquium in Spanish. All right, so last summer we had a colloquium in French by Louis-André Dorion, and we're going to have one this fall in Spanish. That's the next colloquium in 2 weeks by Marcello Boeri. And those of you who are capable of understanding such a colloquium, I hope that we will see you there. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.